Good morning, and welcome to this hearing of the Joint Economic Committee. To begin, I'd like to welcome back members of the committee who were part of this body during the previous Congress, as well as our new members. And I'd like to congratulate Representative Maloney on her return as Vice Chair during this Congress. I look forward to working with all of you. The topic of this hearing, expanding opportunity, is in many ways a quintessentially American topic. As Abraham Lincoln put it so eloquently, the leading object of our government is and has been, and I hope always will be, to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life. In other words, the purpose of government is to remove barriers for opportunity. Often, however, policymakers have a limited understanding of what opportunity is, what that word means. We sometimes see opportunity purely in terms of economic outcomes, namely educational or financial success. And moreover, we can view financial capital as the only important source of wealth on which opportunity in our society depends. Economic wealth is no doubt important. No one would dispute its importance, and it is right that the federal government should certainly seek to remove barriers to economic wealth. But to see opportunity exclusively in those terms fails adequately to capture an individual source of wealth on which human beings draw, and one that is in fact key to expanding opportunity, and that is social capital. Social capital is the wealth produced from our associational life, from what we do together as human beings in a particular society. It inheres in the web of social relationships through which we pursue joint endeavors, and it comes from our families, our communities, churches, synagogues, Rotary clubs, and Little Leagues. And it's through these institutions of civil society that we make a happy and productive life with other people. They shape our characters and our capacities. They help us address the challenges we face in life and provide us with meaning and purpose as we live our lives. For the past 2 years, the Social Capital Project on the Joint Economic Committee has documented trends in our associational life and its distribution across this great country. It has studied the evolving nature, quality, and importance of our associational life, and the relationship it has to different problems our nation is facing. The Joint Economic Committee has recently undertaken the work of exploring the connection between opportunity and social capital. And it's found that opportunity is largely dependent on social capital, available to us through the relationships we have with our families, neighbors, fellow congregants, and coworkers. These relationships are crucial, both to our economic opportunities and our opportunity for producing and sustaining a vibrant, healthy, meaningful community life. And so the goal of the Joint Economic Committee is now to craft policies rooted in social capital, policies that will expand opportunity for all Americans by strengthening families, communities, and civil society in general. This undertaking will, of course, not be without its challenges. After all, social capital is not something we can see or touch or smell. We can't even directly measure it. We almost don't have the vocabulary or the tools to do it. In addition to these difficulties associated with measuring it, there are also some real significant difficulties in establishing its causal importance. And while policy can certainly help promote the bases for a flourishing civil society within our culture, we must also inevitably confront its limits and determine when, whether, to what extent, and in what way the federal government has a part to play in this project, and the extent to which the federal government might be inflicting harm on these institutions. To bound the types of policies under consideration, and based on the past 2 years of research, the project has identified 5 broad goals related to opportunity: making it more affordable to raise a family, increasing how many children are raised by happily married couples, connecting more people to work, improving the effectiveness of investments in youth and young adults, and rebuilding civil society. Our distinguished panelists will help us shed light on these issues and these questions today, and I look forward to hearing their testimony and also to seeing the fruits of our discussion going forward. I now recognize Senator Hassan for her opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Chairman Lee, and thank you for holding a hearing in which we can examine innovative ways to increase economic opportunity in all of our communities. And I want to thank all of the witnesses for being here and being with us today. I want to focus today on how we can create opportunity for entrepreneurs by increasing their access to social connections and personal networks, or in other words, by helping build their social capital. Entrepreneurs frequently use their personal connections to identify business opportunities, find community mentors, and secure the capital that they need to launch and grow their startups. However, not everyone starts off with connections to the business community, and entrepreneurs outside these informal networks can find it harder to access vital resources like financial counseling and capital investment. This presents particular challenges for women entrepreneurs. Last year, the National Women's Business Council issued a report that found that women's personal networks have fewer connections with ties to resources like financial capital. This is also an acutely important issue for entrepreneurs in rural areas of my state. In rural areas, there is often extremely limited access to high-quality, affordable broadband internet, which is absolutely necessary for any business hoping to compete in the modern economy. Limited broadband access slows entrepreneurship and contributes to the so-called brain drain, a problem for rural areas that I know, Mr. Chairman, you focused on in a report on social capital released just last week by this committee. Fortunately, there are successful initiatives that Congress can build on. In New Hampshire, we have many nonprofit organizations and business incubators that are leveraging community interest and federal investments to build social capital for entrepreneurs from all walks of life. New Hampshire's Small Business Development Center provides business advertising and mentorship, for example. Our regional development corporations provide business gap financing, and we have startup accelerators that tailor their services in innovative ways. So there are many programs already underway in the Granite State that can serve as models for our efforts to expand opportunity for entrepreneurs, and I expect there are models in lots of other states as well. In my view, having the opportunity to start and grow a business shouldn't be all about who you know. Equality of opportunity for entrepreneurs should be predicated on a willingness to work hard to transform an innovative idea into a reality. The bottom line is that we have to do more to level the playing field and help aspiring business owners build social capital. Our country was founded on the idea that nurturing the talent and energy of every person promotes human dignity and ignites a vibrant and competitive economy. And government certainly has a role in ensuring that we do just that. When we bring people in from the margins, our communities, our democracy, and our economy all benefit. We thrive and we build a stronger future for our children. So I look forward to our witnesses' testimony today on how we can help all Americans build social capital. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hassan. I'd now like to introduce our distinguished witnesses and thank all of you today for being here with us. First, we have Dr. Nathaniel Hendren, Professor of Economics at Harvard University and founding co-director of Opportunity Insights. His work has documented the extent of equality of opportunity across a range of domains, from the inability of individuals to purchase insurance to the difficulties faced by low-income children seeking upward mobility, and more recently, the disparities in intergenerational mobility experienced by children of different races. Welcome, Dr. Hendren. Next, we have Dr. Ryan Streeter, who is the Director of Domestic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he oversees research in education, American citizenship, politics, public opinion, and social and cultural studies. Before joining AEI, he was the Executive Director of the Center for Politics and Governance at the University of Texas at Austin. Thanks for being with us today, Dr. Streeter. Next, we have Mr. José Quiñonez, founder of and CEO of Mission Asset Fund, an award-winning nonprofit organization that helps financially excluded communities to participate in the mainstream U.S. financial system. He's received a number of honors and awards for his work, including the 2013 Irvine Leadership Award, and was nominated for the San Francisco Chronicle's 2019 Visionary of the Year. Welcome, Mr. Quiñonez. And we have Dr. Patrick Sharkey, professor and chair of the Department of Sociology at New York University, teaching courses in urban policy, criminology, statistics, and violence. He is also scientific director at the Crime Lab New York. He has authored a number of books, including the award-winning Stuck in Place: Urban Neighborhoods and the End of Progress Toward Racial Equality. Thank you for being here, Dr. Sharkey. We are all very grateful that you're here, and we'll give each of you now an opportunity to present your testimony. We'll start with you, Dr. Hendren, and move forward in the order in which you were introduced.
Thank you. So I do have some presented slides. I don't know if it's possible to show them on the screen. If it is, feel free, and if there is a clicker for the slides, I would be delighted to use it. If not, I'm happy to just roll. All right. All right, so thank you for the opportunity to be here to talk with you today. I think like many of us, I grew up inspired by the notion of the American dream, this idea that every child should have an opportunity to climb that income ladder. In my research with a broad set of collaborators, we try to measure the extent to which we live up to this ideal. Unfortunately, our research shows that this dream is simply out of reach for too many children. There are many ways of quantifying the American dream, but one way to measure it is to ask what fraction of children grow up to earn more than their parents in adulthood. Now, we find that for children born in 1940, the American dream was nearly a guarantee. 90% of those kids grew up to earn more than their parents. But today, only half of children grow up to earn more than their parents. Now, another measure of the American dream is the likelihood that a child born in the bottom of the income distribution grows up to reach the top regions of the income distribution, sort of the ability to go from rags to riches. Now, if incomes in adulthood were perfectly independent of one's background, we would expect that 20% of those with low-income parents would grow up to reach the top fifth of the income distribution in adulthood. But in the U.S., only 7.5% of children whose parents are in the bottom fifth of the income distribution grow up to reach the top fifth of the income distribution. Now, perhaps perfect mobility of 20% is too high of a standard. Another benchmark is to think about comparing across countries. Here again, the US lags behind. In the UK, 9% of children grow up to reach the top fifth from low-income backgrounds, 11.7% in Denmark, 13.5% from Canada, and 15.7% in Sweden. Now, this broad pattern in the US masks the fact that there are places in the United States where the American dream is alive and well. Rates of upward mobility vary dramatically across the country, and even within cities. In some neighborhoods, for example, in Provo, Utah, children from low-income families grow up to earn $66,000 on average at age 35. In contrast, low-income children who grow up in parts of inner Baltimore with parents of the same income backgrounds earn on average only $16,000 in adulthood. Now, upward mobility varies even more when we compare across neighborhoods within cities. As we've documented in the Opportunity Atlas, children who grow up just a few miles apart in families with comparable incomes have very different later life outcomes. For example, children who grow up in other parts of Provo, Utah, earn just $30,000 a year on average, less than half of their counterparts at $66,000. Or to take another example here in Midtown Manhattan, where poor children growing up on either side of 3rd Avenue earn either $28,000 a year or $45,000 a year on average in adulthood. And so these striking disparities raise the natural question, why do outcomes differ so dramatically across places in the United States? Now, our results suggest that the outcomes we see today of people in adulthood have their roots in the neighborhood environments in which these children grew up. Every year, a child spends growing up in a neighborhood with higher rates of upward mobility increases their incomes in adulthood. And so the message is simple: neighborhoods matter. Where we grew up shapes our outcomes in adulthood. If we can improve the neighborhood environments for children, especially for those who are most disadvantaged among us, we can increase upward mobility in the United States. The variation in the Opportunity Atlas, we believe, provides a learning opportunity that can inform such efforts, where we can attempt to replicate the successes of places with high rates of upward mobility. Now, across the U.S., we do see that places with higher rates of upward mobility tend to be places where children are growing up in neighborhoods with lower poverty rates, stronger measures of school quality, stronger family structures, and stronger measures of social capital. I do want to be clear today: while we can identify the characteristics of neighborhoods that tend to promote high rates of upward mobility, current limitations prevent us from identifying the best policies for improving upward mobility, and to that aim, I look forward to an extensive discussion. And I'm excited about our ongoing endeavors and collaborations on our end with researchers at the Census Bureau and Treasury Department to further understand these potential pathways to promoting upward mobility. Uncovering the recipe for success won't be easy, but thanks to access to administrative data and support of government research, I do believe we can make progress on this important question. And more generally, I'm delighted to be here today to discuss how we might learn from evidence to inform policies that might improve upward mobility. And while I know there's a lot of disagreement in politics, it is my hope and belief that an evidence-based approach to improving upward mobility and opportunity for all of our children is a purpose that spans party lines and allows us to begin to restore the American dream. So thank you for letting me be here today.
Thank you. Dr. Streeter.
Thank you, Chairman Lee, Senator Hassan, and members of the committee for asking us to come and testify today on the important relationship between social capital and opportunity in America. Through several decades of research, we know that social capital positively affects a wide range of things that we all care about and desire, such as good work, happy family lives, a good education, safety for our kids, and opportunity for us and others. Yet we do not utilize what we have learned about social capital very effectively in domestic policymaking anymore. And before explaining what I mean by that and talking about policy, I would like to share some relevant data points from our research at the American Enterprise Institute on social capital in America. The benefits of social capital are especially interesting when we look at how the informal elements of social capital, such as talking with and getting together with neighbors and friends, and formal elements, such as volunteering in civic groups, relate to one another and other things that we care about. Consider the following: 46% of people who are both highly civic and highly social rate the communities where they live as excellent, compared to 36% of people who are highly social but not very civically engaged in their communities. Highly civic people and people who are highly civic and social are the least likely to say they would move away from their community if they could. They are more attached to where they live than others. When you ask people if they get a strong sense of community from their neighborhood, highly civic people are more likely to say yes, compared with people who are just highly social. Social people with lots of friends are very happy, but those who are also civically engaged are even happier still. People who are civically engaged but not especially social are more likely to report never feeling lonely than people who are very social but not civically engaged. I could go on, but suffice it to say that America's health is greatly enhanced, city by city, by those who embrace their communities out of a sense of responsibility. To think about the future of social capital in public policy, it's worth taking a look at the past. We know so much more about the benefits of social capital today, thanks to the research of people like Dr. Hendren and others, than we did in the mid-1990s, but strangely, we incorporate these ideas less today when we're designing policy solutions. For example, from 1991 to 1996, we saw 4 major domestic policy reforms at the federal and state levels that all presuppose the indispensable value of basic units of civil society, family, neighborhood, community, in their very policy design. Each understood in its own way that civic and social networks were important elements of policy success. The first reform was in school policy, which began in Milwaukee in 1990 with the first voucher law, and in Minnesota in 1991 with the first charter law, and then rippled across the country. The premise of the school reform movement was to empower parents and families to either form their own schools in cooperation with community leaders or have the ultimate choice in where their kids went to school. Empowering civically minded school reformers was central to the movement's success. The second reform concerns public housing, which in city after city had become a symbol of failed policy, riddled with crime, drugs, and persistent poverty. Hope 6, which Congress created in 1992, made the neighborhood, rather than simple units of housing, the central focus of public housing assistance. Housing projects were torn down and replaced with mixed income, sometimes mixed-use developments that gave families in public housing a greater stake in their neighborhood, or at least that was the intention. The third reform is community policing, which predates the 1990s, but it was a federal law in 1994 that effectively made it a nationwide practice. In the 10 years after the law passed, the share of municipal police departments practicing community policing grew from about 20% to 68%. Today, 80% of police departments practice community policing, which replaces command and control crime response with crime prevention rooted in neighborhood-level partnerships. Fourth, and perhaps the best known, is welfare reform, which was created in 1996 amidst quite a bit of public debate. Most of the debate then, as now, was focused on the merits of work requirements and the time limits on welfare recipients. Less debated, but just as important, was the positive effect experienced by states that devolved responsibility for work outcomes to the municipal level. Where that happened, local leaders stepped up and took ownership for helping people find work, with generally impressive results. If we hope to continue to make progress serving individuals and families struggling to fully participate in the American economy, we need to focus on the centrality of community relationships once again. Whatever the merits of our current debates on a range of issues, from subsidizing wages or making college less expensive or even free, and so on, if we fail to recognize the important role that networks play at the local and regional levels in people's upward mobility prospects, our national debates about these former types of policy will achieve limited impact. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Quinonez.
Talk. Thank you, Chairman Lee, Senator Hassan, and members of the Joint Economic Committee for having this important hearing. My name is José Quiñonez. I'm an immigrant, came to this country in the dark of night as a 9-year-old, adjusted my status through the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, became a U.S. citizen, and now I'm living my American dream of helping low-income people become visible, active, and successful in the marketplace. As the CEO of the Mission Asset Fund, a nonprofit organization based in San Francisco, I have firsthand experience addressing the daunting financial challenges our clients face every day. And what I've learned is this: being poor in America is expensive, particularly for people living outside of the financial mainstream. Nationally, 1 in 7 Latinos are unbanked, meaning that they don't have checking accounts or savings accounts. And while researchers point to various reasons for why people go without accounts, we know banks exclude people based on immigration status or by requiring narrow forms of IDs. Consequently, many of our clients are left unbanked and without a choice but to rely on alternative providers that charge more to cash checks or pay bills. The average household, underserved household that earns $25,000 annually pays about 10% of that income on fees and interest for financial services that those of us with bank accounts often get for free. Lack of credit is a challenge. Nationally, nearly 1 in 3 Latinos are credit invisible, meaning they do not have credit scores or credit reports. And given the nature of our economy, there's little anyone can do without credit. People cannot get loans to buy homes, start businesses, they cannot rent apartments. In some states, they can't even get jobs without employers checking their credit reports. And without access to credit, affordable credit, people turn to high-cost lenders, some paying 100% APRs on small dollar loans and significantly more for short-term payday loans. Barriers to economic mobility are not just financial. People are also burdened with uncertainty from the current anti-immigrant political climate, fearing losing their families and draining their savings. Many worry about being detained for lack of documentation, igniting a financial crisis. Bail alone could strip them of $5,000, obtaining legal representation up to $20,000, and the costs mount from there. So how can we help people realize economic potential when they are financially invisible and also facing enormous challenges in their lives? We found answers in how our clients leverage social capital, their relationships with family and friends in order to survive and thrive. Our clients practice a time-honored tradition of lending and saving money together. It's an activity known by 100 different names the world over, but which is essentially the same. A group of people come together and agree to pool their money so that one member of the group can take the lump sum, and they do it again on a weekly or monthly basis until everyone in the group has had a chance of getting the lump sum. So when people don't have access to loans, this is how they create their own, using their word and trust. We built our Lending Circles program on this tradition. We formalized loans by having participants sign promissory notes which MAF then services and reports to credit bureaus. Since launching the program in 2008, we have made over 11,000 loans to help participants build credit. In fact, they see an average increase of 168 points, opening a world of possibilities for them in the credit market. And the repayment rate is 99.3%, an unheard of rate in the microlending world. Lending Circles is an example of what we could do with and for people if we design programs and policies for success, based on people's strengths and social capital to create lasting change. But despite the promise of this approach, it is not enough to help the millions of people that are still trapped with barriers diminishing their economic potential. We need better data to understand people's challenges. Research reports based on national data sets often ignore those who are financially invisible, thereby missing critical segments of our society. Congress can also remove asset limits to public benefit programs like SNAP that are a lifeline for families not earning enough to make ends meet. Congress could also provide clarity that U.S. citizenship is not a prerequisite for accessing financial services and allow for more government-issued IDs when opening accounts. Congress could also significantly reduce the number of credit invisible by allowing positive payment data from utilities, rent, and telecoms to be included in credit reports. And Congress can require ability to repay underwriting standards and longer repayment terms for small dollar and payday loans. I believe these reforms can go a long way in unlocking people's economic potentials and help them realize their American dreams too. So thank you for holding this hearing, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Dr. Sharkey.
Thank you, Chairman Lee, Senator Hassan, and the members of the committee. I'll focus my comments on a basic question to the study of social capital. How do we build stronger communities? Let me first give a sense of the problem we're facing. Several decades of evidence, which has been bolstered by the work of Dr. Hendren and his collaborators, has led to a clear conclusion. Neighborhoods in which children are raised play a central role in influencing their academic achievement, their cognitive development, their physical and mental well-being, and their economic mobility. Labor market opportunities, environmental hazards, the quality of institutions like schools, libraries, financial institutions, police departments vary dramatically depending on where one lives, creating a rigid geography of vulnerability and opportunity. And the problem is multi-generational. The vast majority of children who currently reside in poor neighborhoods are from families that have lived in similarly poor neighborhoods for multiple generations. Okay, so we know, the evidence tells us that the consequences of living in highly disadvantaged neighborhoods are cumulative, with long-lasting effects that persist across generations. There are good reasons to think that this link between our communities and our life chances is growing stronger. As income inequality in the nation as a whole has increased, economic segregation has grown, meaning the rich and the poor are increasingly likely to live apart, sorting into separate communities. Inequality between cities and regions is also growing. While many coastal and Sunbelt cities like New York and San Diego have attracted newcomers with higher income, better education, other sections of the country, Rust Belt cities like Detroit and Cleveland, have seen higher income, better educated residents leave. As a result, metropolitan areas have begun to look more and more different from each other. Some with bustling economies offering relatively high-wage jobs, others isolated from economic opportunity. And as this type of regional inequality has increased, long-range geographic mobility, the kind of mobility that has always served as a way to allow Americans to take advantage of new opportunities in new places, has fallen, particularly for the less advantaged segments of the population, racial and ethnic minorities, people with less education. This is a challenge that faces America's neighborhoods. Now, how do we get to this point? As urban economies began to shift, starting in the 1940s and 50s and all the way through the 1980s, a set of social problems like joblessness, segregation, pollution, and poverty became concentrated in central cities. Our response was not a sustained national project of investment to respond to these challenges. Instead, our response was to abandon central cities, to withdraw resources, and to provide ways for the most advantaged segments of the population to leave central cities and to head to the suburbs. As the share of city budgets from federal sources plummeted, public housing deteriorated, public schools crumbled, fiscal conditions worsened, neighborhoods emptied out, institutions like churches and community organizations withered away. This is what happens when communities are abandoned. If we want to build stronger communities, we need to shift from a model of abandonment to a model of community investment. In the American Enterprise Institute's survey on community and society, a national sample of respondents was asked, what makes a community successful? The responses are revealing. The two top responses were good local schools and having libraries and community centers nearby. A great deal of evidence suggests that the respondents are on the right track. The most effective way to build stronger communities is to invest in core public institutions like schools and libraries that bring people together in shared spaces, and in local organizations, including faith-based organizations, community development corporations, prisoner reentry programs, child care providers, mentorship and after-school programs, organizations like the Mission Asset Fund that provide the foundation for every community, making them less vulnerable to the next crisis to hit America's neighborhoods. Thank you for bringing us together. This is a great group of speakers, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. We'll now begin 5-minute question rounds. I'll go first, followed by Senator Hass, then we will alternate Republican and Democrat in order of arrival at the hearing. Dr. Hendren, I'll start with you. You mentioned my hometown of Provo, Utah, in your testimony today, and you've listed Utah communities as among the most upwardly mobile in some of your writings. Now, in my experience, there's a Moscow in Idaho, there is a London in Kentucky, there's even a Newark in Delaware, but there is no other Provo. Nonetheless, there are some communities like Provo where upward economic mobility is possible. What is it that you found in your research that differentiates Provo and communities like it from other communities where you don't see that kind of social capital and economic opportunity?
Well, thanks for the question. So I will preface this by saying I have not actually been to Provo, Utah, so I will, but I can tell you,
have to remedy that.
But what I will say is when we look broadly across the U.S., in places like Provo that have some of the highest rates of upward mobility, what we find is really the 4 characteristics that I mentioned in my testimony. It's places that have strong schools, it's places that have less residential segregation and less income inequality, places that have stronger measures of social capital, and places with stronger family structures. Now, what is it about a place in particular that drives its high rates of upward mobility? That's a question to which we don't know the exact answer. But in a place like Utah, the fraction, ways of measuring social capital, 2 things sort of come to mind. It's a place where a wide range of measures of social capital score highly. There's a high fraction of religious populations there. And in the U.S. more broadly, we see that places that have a higher fraction of people who are religious, we do see higher rates of upward mobility. We also see places that have people that return their census forms have higher rates of upward mobility, speaking to some of that civic engagement. And so this, I think you phrased it right, that what we see is something amorphous that is hard to really put a finger on what exactly is driving the high rates of upward mobility, but what we can say are there are these characteristics that do correlate more broadly across the U.S.
I found it interesting when you mentioned in your written testimony that there are some poor neighborhoods in Provo where children raised in those neighborhoods, by the time they're 35, are earning $60,000, $65,000 a year. There are other neighborhoods where that is not the case. Are these same correlators present or absent in one neighborhood or the other? Are those the same things that differentiate one neighborhood within the same town as one town from another?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it comes back to the statements earlier. Across the U.S., metro areas that have a higher degree of things like residential segregation or lower measures of social capital have lower rates of upward mobility on average. When you zoom in within a locality, what you find is the children growing up in these segregated neighborhoods tend to have lower rates of upward mobility, or conversely, in places where measures of social capital are lower, those are places that have lower rates of upward mobility, even within cities, if that makes sense.
Oh, thank you. That's helpful. Dr. Strader, in recent years, there's been a really rapid growth in technology. We've seen the rise of the iPhone, of Twitter, of other social media platforms. And those are things that have, in some ways, enabled easier communication between people. It connects one person to a whole lot of other people. But But it's also been argued that these same technologies might degrade, might undermine people's ability to access an education and also interfere with somebody's ability or inclination to have personal interactions with someone else. I heard from the president of a large university recently. She told me that as people have become more accustomed to learning things by YouTube and through Google searches, students today, even highly performing students in terms of their entering test scores and high school GPA, sometimes don't like to memorize because they consider it useless. It's one of many ways in which it's changing the way people learn. But what do you think about the potential effects of technology on social capital formation?
Well, I'd start out by saying there's a lot that we still don't know about the effect of technology on social capital, and there is some evidence that increased screen time among younger people on their phones correlates pretty strongly with increased incidences of self-reported mood disorders, depression, and the like. There's some evidence that is the case. What I would say is, from our own survey work, we found that people who regularly interact with people that they consider close friends and family are generally less lonely and happier. And the more friends that you have, the less lonely you are. That might seem to make sense. What we found through our own survey research is that when people use digital technology to communicate with friends on a regular basis, that's like interacting often face-to-face. Now, there's nothing quite like joining together in a room and solving problems together. We all know from experience that there's something very valuable there. We know that when people are concentrated in well-functioning neighborhoods, that social capital has benefits for the reasons that have been articulated here. But I think one thing to help maybe mitigate some of our worry and concern about the increased screen time. When you walk up into a room and your kids are there and they're all on their phones and they're not looking up at you, there's something wrong with that. And I think there's evidence to suggest that we are seeing problems, particularly among teenagers, that are related to that phenomenon. However, I also think from our own work, we see that when people are in regular communication with people they're close to, whether that's texting or on phone calls or using other social media, it helps sustain those relationships and it helps people feel less lonely. So there is reason to be optimistic that some of this social media technology actually can help us do things together. And if you actually just examine some of your own interaction, think about people you're close to and how you stay in touch with them. I have a daughter that's in school in the UK. I thought Snapchat was terrible when I heard about it when it was invented. Now I love it. It's a way for me to have visibility into her life every day. I think a lot of people can identify with that. I have a closeness that's enabled through that technology that I didn't have before it existed. And our survey data shows that there's reason to be optimistic that actually does help keep us more closely connected with people that we love and care about.
Thank you. Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you again, Mr. Chair, for convening this panel, and thank you again to the panelists for your testimony. Dr. Hendren, I'd like to ask you about the research you and your Harvard colleagues published in 2014 on the factors that impact the future economic mobility of children across the country, because in my view, the defining aspect of the American dream is the ability of parents to expect that their children will have a better future, a more prosperous future than they had. While your studies, while you single out social capital, and you mentioned that it was some of the characteristics of social capital are somewhat amorphous. You also said that important factors in increasing a child's economic opportunities include school quality, income inequality, racial segregation, and family structure, and that those two impact future economic mobility. And I'd suggest they're somewhat less amorphous. They are measurable. So can you tell the committee about how these other major factors, such as school quality, also impact a child's future economic opportunities? And also, do these factors mutually reinforce and interact with one another? For example, do neighborhoods with both higher quality schooling and more social capital provide greater future economic mobility for children?
Great, thanks for the question. So you're correct that broadly we find 5 factors correlated with upward mobility: school quality, income inequality, social capital, strength of the family structure, and poverty rates. In terms of school quality in particular, the ways in which we measure school quality are broad and vast, and I agree there's many ways to measure it. So you can look at third grade or eighth grade test scores of students on state exams in places or in neighborhoods that have stronger scores on those exams. In particular, scores by low-income students, you see higher rates of upward mobility. In places that have less residential segregation, either on the race dimension or the income dimension, you see higher rates of upward mobility. And to get to your last question, it looks like these 5 factors are in a sense additive across the U.S., that one factor seems to correlate with higher rates of upward mobility, even conditional on the other factors as well. And so in places that have both high, strong schools and more, say, two-parent households, those neighborhoods tend to have higher rates of upward mobility.
Thank you. Mr. Quiñonez, I'd like to ask you about an important issue you raise in your essay, Latinos in the Financial Shadows. You point out that as online banking becomes more mainstream, some families may lose access to bank representatives such as tellers who help them navigate the financial system. This is an especially important concern in New Hampshire, where many of my constituents also lack access to quality, affordable broadband internet. So on the one hand, you have fewer human beings to interact and help navigate, and on the other hand, you also have people who really don't have access to the online function as well. So fewer bank storefronts and inadequate broadband access can make building credit a real challenge. One way to fill this gap in service, as you say in your essay, is for community nonprofits to partner with financial institutions and to provide families with financial advice. How do you think community relationships between nonprofits and financial institutions can help fill gaps between storefront and online banking services? And how can Congress support and encourage these relationships?
Thank you so much for that question. And I think it goes back to the question of being present, being there. Because as those bank branches start to close, and not just banks, but credit unions are beginning to close all over the country, they're not present in those communities anymore. So those institutions are going to be lacking. And so I'm just lifting up, the fact that there are nonprofit organizations, there are faith-based organizations in those locations as well. So there's another way for us to sort of interact and provide them with the tools and resources so that they can be the front-facing, the relationship bridge between what people are experiencing in terms of their hardships or even advice and suggestions so that they can continue on moving with their economic lives. So I believe that nonprofits could play a certain, a key role there, but that hasn't been part of the conversation just yet. So, in that particular essay, I was just like, well, here's organizations that are already in those communities. We can figure out how to either provide them with resources or maybe connect them more closely with financial institutions so that as they close those branches, those nonprofit organizations can actually step in and provide more of that services there.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate all of you very much. I had a question that I will ask for the record, really asking you all to help us prioritize steps we could take to encourage and grow social capital in our communities and address some of the issues you've all identified. Thank you all for your very important work. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Merchant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the House have we represent communities that unfortunately change every 10 years. So we have kind of artificially created districts that are many times kind of drawn together in a very interesting way. My district, it has 15 communities that surround an airport. So you have an economic driver, then you have 15 communities. Many of those communities share school districts, so you don't have 15 different school districts. You have, but it has a great diversity of racial diversity and great economic diversity. Over the period of 10 years, most people think that these kind of changes come over decades. But in our environment, the suburban environment that we live in, and these districts evolve very quickly. So in our area, we have had because it's a corporate atmosphere around the airport, and because the airport, the population growth has to bring in a very high earner into the community, while the community stays pretty much the same. But it's making those that were there before the high earners arrived, actually pushing them into a lower economic strata. And of course, when the school districts grow at that level, it forces them to rezone the schools on a regular basis, so that when you begin to rezone the schools, you zone it more towards the neighborhood. The neighborhood then pretty much throws diversity kind of out the window because it's looking for proximity. So you end up with very stratified racial school district zones where you have less diversity among the students learning together. And my question is when you look at a situation like that, is the question of school choice more important? Is the question of a district evolving from 90% homeowners to 50% apartment dwellers now, because the corporations are bringing in workers that are not going to live there long? They're staying in an apartment. They're not as connected to the community. So this is becoming, across the nation, as big a problem as these old stratified neighborhoods that are slowly declining, but you have districts that are kind of exploding as far as these problems go. And Dr. Streeter, Dr. Hendren, any of you that would like to comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
Just to one part of your remarks and question, I do think that what's driving this is an interrelation of a couple of complex things, right? And so I won't diagnose those all entirely, although I have some things to say there, and I know the others here are more qualified than I am to talk about that. But I do think in that environment, allowing flexibility with where families can send their children to school is an important thing. I think having options, that competitive pressure that happens with a competitive educational marketplace is generally a good thing. I think it's been good just a few blocks from here. You can visit neighborhoods that have benefited where traditional schools and charters and et cetera have benefited from that kind of competition. I do think that the challenges for this sort of sorting and segregation that happens by income at the regional level is driven very much by local choices. And I think the tools available to federal policymakers on some of these things are actually quite limited. I think that when it comes to how zoning is done and the way that neighborhoods are sort of constructed, that's driven very much by local and state policy. And I think that right now is driving a lot of these factors that we see in terms of inequality by geography.
Yeah, I think that you raise tough questions. I think when it comes to zoning and other policies that are traditionally done at the local level, the only thing that I would be able to bring to that conversation is to note that it has national implications, that kind of the outcomes we see in adulthood for kids that grow up in those neighborhoods tend to be higher in places where kids from different backgrounds tend to grow up together. And so thinking about the types of policies, the ways in which policy interacts with those incentives is what I would say is important, but exactly how to turn that into local policy or regulations about local policy, I don't have a strong view at the time.
I could just add one last comment on that. You're describing the growing phenomenon of economic segregation, high and low income people living nearby in the same area but living in different communities. And the reason it becomes important is because as neighborhoods become more and more segregated, investment in different communities becomes more and more unequal. So, you know, there are steps to take. If there is affordable housing in every neighborhood around the airports and in every district, in every neighborhood within your district, then you will have some level of economic segregation. Schools will become more integrated as well. But the key is that if there are investments, if there are core organizations in every single neighborhood, then the consequences of that kind of economic segregation become less severe.
Representative Heck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is my inaugural meeting of the JEC. I just want to signal it's it's a privilege and an honor to join the committee, and I'm very pleased to be here. Also want to express my appreciation to the chair for selecting this topic. I think it's important and very worthwhile use of our time, although my concern is that we would devolve down the track of either social investment or social capital, which frankly I think, reminds me of the old beer commercial where two people bark at each other, less filling, tastes great, to no end, and frankly, and unfortunately is emblematic of everything that's wrong with this town, the either or stuff. But having said all that, it seems to me that we've got a couple of kinds of communities that are relevant to this conversation. Those for whom there has been an absence of opportunity for quite some time that's structural, it's associated with all the factors that have been researched, Dr. Sharkey, Dr. Hendren, racial discrimination, and others. And then you have other communities where it didn't used to be that case, but then there's traumatic job loss, and it becomes the case. Everybody has that perspective, whether it's the mining community in Appalachia or the factory town in the Midwest, or in the part of the country that Congresswoman Herrera Butler and I live in, the closure of the sawmill, where there's just been this precipitous loss. We have some counties in Washington State, for example, that have had double-digit unemployment literally for 25 years because of the closure of the timber industry. Double-digit, 25 years. And so to me, it kind of begs the question, however, with respect to social capital, is it destroyed, demeaned, diluted by traumatic job loss? Dr. Sharkey, let's go down the line.
Thank you, Representative Heck, for the question. It's a great question. I think in sections of the country that have gone through this kind of economic dislocation, then it sets the stage for a whole set of additional problems. It sets the stage for the loss of social capital that we've all been discussing. It's not inevitable, however. I think that what destroys communities is when there is a combination of this kind of economic shock or long-term economic distress combined with the absence of a foundation of strong community institutions that are unable to absorb people who are unemployed, people who need additional training, people who need to go back to school, or who need short-term support in order to get back on their feet and reintegrate into the labor market. So it's really this interaction between economic distress and the absence of a strong foundation of community institutions that creates the kind of...
But they affect one another.
I think they interact together, exactly.
My time's limited, so I guess I want to get to my second and last question, Dr. Hendren. A lot of your really informative research relates to upward mobility and going from one income bracket to another. But I'm curious as to your reaction about the context here. The truth of the matter is for 40 years, about 88% of this country has been within an income bracket which hasn't budged. Wage stagnation. That's the context. Your research is how do we get from here to here, but the fact of the matter, wherever here is, has been flatlined for 40 years. And you didn't say anything in your testimony, nor am I aware of anything in your research that says how does that context bear upon the upward mobility? A word or two, please, sir.
Oh, that's very, thank you for the question, and it's a delight to be able to answer that. You're absolutely right that the statistic I quoted on the 7.5% of kids from low-income families that reach the top of the income distribution is sort of a comparative statistic within the income distribution. In terms of statistics that capture exactly that phenomenon.
If I may interrupt, as it relates to social investment, it's much higher in countries that have greater social investment. But I interrupt. Go ahead.
That is true. When you look across cohorts, people who were born in 1940, 90% of them grew up to earn more than their parents. The reason that is because we experienced broad-based equal growth across the income distribution. Today, 50% of kids grow up to earn more than their parents, and the exact reason for that, statistically, is exactly the phenomenon you mentioned, which is that there has not been real wage growth at the median of the income distribution. That is simply kind of a mathematical restatement of exactly the phenomenon you're mentioning. So in terms of whether or not kids earn more than their parents, that is a direct implication of the statistics you're deciding.
And if I had more time, we'd talk a little bit about the importance of the Fed's monetary policy on that fact and how it is that their over-concern about overheating of the economy has caused them to tap the brakes too rapidly, thus suppressing wage growth. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Representative Herrera Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is this is the busy season here in DC. But I feel like this is one of those conversations that could go over several days and should, quite frankly. Because when I think about the issues at home, you know, Representative Heck mentioned West Coast, you know, been decimated in certain areas by timber industry and in federal policy, quite frankly. But how do we grow back? And I'm sandwiched in between Seattle and Portland. I mean, I'm the great sandwich part in the middle, not the bun on either ends. But they're struggling with housing policy, and it's impacting all of us. There's some real, there's some incredible tragedy taking place because of the impacts on people's lives, or people who are losing their lives. And I think this conversation so directly relates to how we change that. I found it really interesting that you mentioned, you were talking about, and I've heard it several times now, and Dr. Sharkey was talking about the difference in this, the strength of the schools and the community foundation institutions, the strength of the family. And what I keep coming back to is, what does that actually mean? You know, I have an idea in my mind. I can tell you, in my father's, I'm of Hispanic heritage, and they grew up very poor. Had very little, 10 kids in one room, and here I get to sit before you today, right? And it's not because my parents did anything more than work hard, and I know that these elements were there, but I can't define it. So how do we define it? Is it so it's not always money in schools. You can compare Utah schools to DC schools to other schools, and in Washington State we have a lot of school choice, believe it or not. There's a lot of people who choose, and I think this is critical, choose to, whether it's that we have public homeschools in Washington State. So there's all these different choices, and I think that contributes. But what does it look like? How do we find a definition for this? How do we put a more concrete, some concrete samples here? So it's kind of open to everybody, because I think everybody had a piece. But I'd love to hear thoughts.
Thank you for having a broader perspective or even question about that, because I would caution us in trying to define social capital very narrowly. Of only thinking about institutions, or because sometimes even those institutions they're just vessels where relationships actually happen. And so, and if anything, from my story and the story of MAF is that, you know, poor people also have social capital because they also have relationships. Because it is based on those relationships that we rely on to survive, to weather any economic shock or any political sort of, you know, antagonism against people. And it's those relationships that really that are, you know, are really central to our human condition. So this is not new, right? I mean, this is why people left Africa and started migrating out and conquering the world, right? Because we had those relationships to base on. So this is not anything new, but if we only think of them as being very specific to a very specific type of folk, then I think we miss the bigger picture. And so I think once we start realizing and validating this, that the relationships that people have to bear, and start, you know, doing away with policies that actually, you know, try to, you know, break down families. I mean, you know, I mentioned, you know, our current political climate. That's, you know, that actually deteriorates the social capital within very specific groups of individuals. And so it's kind of, you know, acknowledging the broader sense of what the capital is, and trying to not, you know, put up policies to, you know, that could break up families in the process.
I would also just add to those good comments, just two quick things. From our own work, it's really important that people feel like they belong, and I think that's one big element here. If you actually have people that you can point to in your lives that you can rely on in times of need when things are tough. That helps against a whole range of other types of problems. So, truly lonely people are people not who just have feelings of loneliness from time to time, but people who actually don't have someone to turn to when they have real needs. We see that pretty clearly in our data. Secondly, I would say, and thank you, Dr. Sharkey, for referring to this earlier, in our survey work on community institutions. We have another study coming out on this in a few weeks, which I'm happy to share with your staff. It really does show that when you have access to libraries, good schools, the way a community is designed, even gyms, even if you don't use the gyms, it turns out when you're close to a range of things that create cohesiveness in a community, it's predictive of a lot of things: lower levels of loneliness, higher trust in institutions, and the like. Now, I realize that's not a panacea. That's not a response to a major economic shock. If a factory closes or an entire industry evaporates from a community, you can't then say after the fact we're going to build these institutions. But it is an argument for investing in those institutions and those types of communities now. And we find this to be true whether it's large cities, suburbs, or rural areas. It doesn't matter what type of municipality you live in. It's when you have a density and proximity to those kind of community institutions that actually make a community that are predictive of a whole bunch of very good things.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Beatty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel. And let me also say what an honor it is for me to serve on this committee, not only from a personal reason, but I also think it's a good marriage for me serving on the House Financial Services Committee and being chairwoman of the Diversity and Inclusion Subcommittee, because much of what we're doing there is talking about how can we be more inclusive as we look at expanding opportunities and making families and communities in a better position in place to thrive economically. I have a great appreciation for all of your research, your writings, and your comments today, and can actually say that I liked just about everything you said. But it gives me pause to ask a few questions. Mr. Hendren, in your testimony, you state that current data limitations prevent us from identifying the best policies for improving upward mobility. Can you be quickly a little more specific about what that means?
Sure. So that is a reference to the fact that frankly, the way in which the census is constructed is it's a repeated cross-section survey of people in the population. And at present, it's actually quite difficult to link people over time in that data. So as we look at the historical policies that have been implemented in our neighborhoods over the last 50 years, it's actually quite difficult to understand the extent to which those policies have improved the lives of people in those neighborhoods versus simply changed where people live. So that was the particular reference I was providing there.
Thank you. All of you presented data and information, but it made me, sitting here as an African-American female who wasn't born quite in the 1940s, as you talked about the wonderful opportunities of children making more, living better than their families. And you all talked about whether it was schools or neighborhoods or housing. It made me feel we needed a little history lesson to remind us of Brown versus the Board of Education in 1950, of Ruby Bridges in 1960. And in some of those southern states in 1964 and 65, during my lifetime, you couldn't even vote. And because of the color of your skin, there was something called redlining. You couldn't live in communities. So here we are today in 2019, basically talking about the same things that I heard my parents talking about in the late 40s and early 50s. So here we are. What are your thoughts on the effect of the growing income opportunity gaps? Do you think it presents a national emergency? We're talking about it here in the wonderful Senate on this committee, but what's the resolve? Are we in in an emergency nationally? And what should this committee do? Quickly, we're going to go right down the line with you, Dr. Sharkey.
Sure. It's a great question. Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. I think There's a hard answer, okay? So
Is it a natural emergency? Yes
so
or no?
the
Only
growth-
so I can get through
The
everything.
growth in income inequality, I think, is a national trend that has very
So is that yes
severe
to a national
implications. I would say
emergency?
close to yes.
Okay, we're going to go here. Only because I only have a minute left.
I say also it's a national emergency, and I also brought up the IRCA 1986 law as a way as a history.
Sure.
My social capital was realized because of that particular legislation. I was able to adjust my status, and I think if we do that to the millions of people that are in similar situations, we can also allow for the social, the economic mobility.
I hate to interrupt you again. So that's a yes,
Yes,
correct?
that is a hard
Okay.
yes.
Dr. Strader.
It's an emergency in some places, and it's not an emergency in other places, but it's an emergency in enough places across the country that I do think it's an emergency. And I don't know that then justifies one sort of national policy response. I think in...
Okay, we're going to get
Yeah.
to the next
Okay.
part of that.
All right.
Dr. Hendren.
If calling it a national emergency leads to change, I'm all for it.
And what should that change be? 3 seconds each. Is it legislation? Is it money? Only because I have 30 seconds to go.
They've got more time than me to prepare this.
Come on.
I would say invest in communities, invest
Okay.
in community institutions.
I would start with the comprehensive immigration reform.
Subject our workforce development policies to the same creativity and reform-mindedness that we have with K through 12 and other forms of higher ed.
And take a life course approach across all ages of children and think about where in places where particular ages of kids are falling behind, target programs at those ages.
Let me just say thank you very much, and I yield back my 1 second.
Very good use of time. Representative Schweiker.
1 second early, 1 second wasted. Okay, as you know, there's dozens of questions here, but if I was to, Doctor, if I came to you and said, give me the 1 or 2 top priorities, if I cared a lot about velocity, the movement, up and particularly upward mobility in stratas. As you know, right now there's some very interesting noise in some of the data that's come in over the last 12 months. Still too early to, but there seems to be, particularly in wage, employment stability, those things, some really interesting numbers happening in our lower quartiles of some real health. We have a fairly robust economy. But if I was to look at that in a longer term, if I came to you and said, hey, over the next 20 years, I want to maximize this upward velocity, what would you do?
So I think the surprising thing is I would say focus on children. Even though you're looking at wages you see today, those were produced 20 years ago at least. So I think going back into the schools and realizing that the kind of economic statistics we read every day were formed a long time ago.
Okay, so when you say children, is it the way we train children in the household formation? What is that?
So that comes back to the factors we were discussing. So things like the quality of the schools. So I think investing in children. I do think some of the other factors we've been discussing that are frankly more amorphous, like the strength of the family structure or measures of social capital. I don't have a good solution for what types of policies are best suited to address those issues. But what I can tell you is that they look like they are important.
All right, Doctor, what would you do for velocity?
I agree with Dr. Hendren that the younger the age of the person when you make the investment, the better, the longer, that velocity will show itself out over time. I think that making it possible for people to move around, even just within regions, I think is important. I think portability of benefits, but also more flexibility in the way we do workforce development training so that when people are living on the east side of town and the best school for what they want to do is on the west side of town, making it possible for them to actually go to school over there and finish. And if the car breaks down, to have resources to fix the car. I think some of the very real inhibitors.
You see a transportation barrier
just greater geographic mobility, even within regions, I think is something that would help a lot of people if we thought more creatively about that.
When you look at your community, what creates success? What creates that mobility, that velocity?
So, great question. And I also think mobility, but millions of people can't even get on a plane to fly from the East Coast to the West Coast. And I think we have a lot of people, again, in this country that are barred from doing that, or even barred from having the notion of being, that they belong in this country. So I think we need to address those big questions, nonetheless. And of course, also financial inclusion, having more direct ways of having people, being banked and being, included in the credit system
being
is really
bankable.
important. Yes.
Okay, Dr. Sharkey.
Well, I would agree with my colleagues here, and I would say let's make sure that the inequality in the country as a whole doesn't translate into more and more unequal communities, so that every kid has equivalent opportunities. That's unrealistic, but close to equivalent opportunities, no matter where that child grows up. Okay, so if the schools are functioning well, if there are community centers, after-school programs, then that child has a better chance of rising up. And that happens when there's affordable housing in every neighborhood across a city and a metro area, and the opportunities are more equally distributed.
So in the like when we look at some of the housing statistics, we have the Phoenix area is having wonderful growth right now, but it's also putting quite a squeeze on affordable housing. So in that case, it's a local zoning issue. It's a local. Can I ask? I'm going to sort of say something and then ask you to, if you ever have suggestions, what I can read to absorb. I think there's some very creative ideas out there, as you've written about libraries and those things being. We're seeing some communities that are now setting up sort of a community page. And for, I have a 3.5-year-old daughter, and my wife went on this community page and was getting the playpen and those things from a neighbor we never knew. Turns out we're seeing, there's some writings out there that using that type of social relationship through one of these can actually, there are patterns. In being bankable, we had a situation in Arizona maybe 20-some years ago where someone cashing a check was paying a 20% fee. They were literally giving up one day of labor. So there was an experiment allowing a number of churches and others to actually have functionally an ACH certificate through the banking department. And so the Catholic Church over here was cashing checks, and it crashed the price. So there are creativities out there. On the transportation side, turns out that some organizations, these ride-sharing platforms, will actually do a discounted, so waiting for the bus in Phoenix when it's 110 out, when you can hit the button on a phone and get that ride sharing. We're working on an experiment right now with our local homeless campus where they have lots of jobs, but transportation is our barrier. Turns out, once again, technology may be that solution. The choice that's now coming through where we're starting to have to rethink education of, is education sitting in a room with bricks and a ceiling and this and that, or is part of my education coming through a screen, part of it a neighborhood working group, a neighborhood robotics club? I guess what I'm throwing out, Mr. Chairman, is everything here is quite real, but yet we seem to approach it from 20-year-old solutions instead of understanding we're living in a digital revolution around us. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Representative Byer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Senator, thank you for doing this. I talk to my 4 children all the time about the need to build as much social capital as they can, about loneliness, happiness, their progress in life. Dr. Sharkey, you talked about the positive level and decreased levels of violence, how violent crimes really come down a lot since 1990, but we're still in the dilemma that we have 4.4% of the population and 22% of the world's prisoners. Although I just read that incarceration rate is the lowest it's been in 20 years. You talk about increased investment in the reentry programs, things like offender aid and restoration. But what are the other strategies we can use, recognizing that locking up mom, dad, sister, uncle, whatever, destroys the family?
It's a great question. Thank you for the question. So the decline in violence has brought enormous benefits that have been experienced by the most disadvantaged segments of the population. But the methods that we have relied too heavily on for the last 50 years, which is intensive policing and mass incarceration, have generated these just staggering costs that you mentioned. So what's next? What's the next model? I think we have models in place. For instance, the incarceration rate has plummeted in New York. There's no increase in violence. Okay, we know that we can reduce the incarcerated population without consequences on violent crime. I would argue for a investment in law enforcement that allows law enforcement to do their job differently, to build trust, to regain trust, and build relationships, particularly with low-income communities of color. I would argue that local community organizations played a central role in contributing to the drop in violence. They expanded on a large scale in the 1990s and took back parks and playgrounds and city streets and communities. This contributed. We have causal evidence. This contributed to the crime drop. If we invest in those communities, those organizations that run reentry programs, that work to try to reintegrate people coming out of the prison system into jobs, into homes, back into their family life, then that's the best evidence. The best evidence we have suggests that that is the approach. That's the next model moving forward.
Great. Thank you very much. In Northern Virginia, I represent, we have very strong community policing. Not accidentally, all 4 sheriffs tell me they have the lowest number of people in their jails in a couple of decades. So, Mr. Quinonez, I was fascinated by the increase in credit scores. I wonder if you could help me on that. But I'm also a car dealer in real life, and it's amazing how many of the customers we see have terrible credit scores.
Yeah.
And I'd love to connect you later with some of the national NADA and others about providing. We sold 17 million new cars last year, 40 million used cars. That's an enormous impact if you could do the kind of financial training that you do with your folks to help Americans. So.
That's right. Thank you for pointing that out. Credit reports nowadays, I see them as sort of like passports to the, to the marketplace, to the financial marketplace. That without the passport, you're really denied, everything. And so that's why we put so much emphasis on helping people become, visible in the credit marketplace. And one of the ideas that we've pushing is the idea of having the credit system, have more visibility of the totality of people's financial lives. And so the idea of including rental payments or the idea of including, even telecom or even paying their cell phones to be included in the credit reports is actually something that could actually make him become much more visible, but really having a fuller, fuller description of what they're doing with their money. Recently, the company Experian has started a program called Boost. And I have a personal story to share here because one of my nephew, I actually told him about this product, and he went online and he signed up to Boost, and then within a minute, he had his FICO score went up by 29 points. And nothing happened, nothing changed with him. All he did was just say, yes, you look at my my transactional information on his checking account, and through that, the credit system was able to sort of recognize him, better. Whereas before they thought he was more risky, but now he's not less risky, and it's all because the logarithms included more data about him that was able to increase his credit scores by 29 points. So there's a lot of different things we could be doing to get him.
Let me interrupt you because I only have 30 seconds left. I can sign up for Boost tonight, though. Thank you.
Okay.
And Dr. Hendren, I want to have 2 more graphs on your opening chart, which is the poverty rate and also the rate of increase in income, just to really understand why the mobility isn't happening. But the elephant in the room is income inequality. What would the impact of doubling the earned income tax credit have on this?
Well, I guess it would depend on how you pay for it. But, I think there's evidence that suggests it increases labor force participation. It would increase in after-tax incomes for a lot of Americans. And so I think, that would probably be the impact. But again, I think the key thing for creating intergenerational change is whether or not it has spillover effects on children. And there, I think there's some interesting work suggesting that it might, but I think there's a lot of interesting work that needs to be done.
Great, thank you.
Representative Tron.
We're now seeing a new type of segregation in some of the school districts. Gerrymandered school borders that fence out students, which often means segregating students along racial lines. The 2016 GAO report found that public schools are more segregated today by race and class than ever before since the 60s. In many ways, a child's zip codes determining their economic prospects. A few weeks ago, we had Secretary of Education DeVos, and we asked her, and she was very evasive on a question regarding racial segregation posing a threat to the educational opportunities of children of color. Mr. Sharkey, can you speak about the long-lasting consequences of segregation as they relate to social capital and also the lack of social capital impeding upward mobility in communities of color?
Yes, thank you for the question. So there is very strong evidence that, well, first off, we know that segregation gets worse for families with school-age kids. So segregation is not an accident, okay? It is intentional. We have set up policies that allow people to sort into different communities and then to set up barricades that make sure that their kids go to schools with resources and the other kids do not. This is opportunity hoarding. It's very explicit. It's very intentional. It's gone on for decades. We also know with very strong evidence that when kids get the opportunity to go to more economically diverse schools, they do better. Okay, Heather Schwartz has done excellent research on this based on data from Montgomery County, which has a very strong inclusionary zoning program where kids were randomly assigned to housing development. Some were in more economically integrated schools than others. The kids, low-income kids who went to more integrated schools did better. Those improvements in academic achievement lasted for several years following, okay? So we know that segregation harms the academic achievement of low-income kids. We know that economic segregation is particularly severe among families with children, and we know that the consequences extend into later in life.
Mr. Quinonez, studies indicate 80% of jobs are found through social capital, through connections, relationships.
Right.
What government actions have historically prevented communities of color from accessing social capital needed for that economic mobility?
Well, I mean, I'll speak on that from an immigrant perspective. And so one of the realities is that immigrant communities, because of the different types of legal statuses that we may have, and we may live in mixed status families, some may have legal documentation, others may not. That is a huge impediment from really realizing the economic potential. So I mean, to some extent, even like my own family, I mean, we were able to help each other because we were family. We were helping each other, and so that was the essence of our social capital, through friends, and that we were in a similar situation. So the idea of linking, and I hope that I'm being clear about this, is that when we think about economic mobility, we have to think about our broken immigration system, because that in and of itself is really causing a lot of people from not really reaching their economic potential.
Mr. Sharkey, given the persistence of neighborhood segregation and the inequality of social capital, what investments need to be made to ensure every community has the opportunity to succeed and our children can succeed?
Thank you for the question. So there are two sets of investments we can think about, and Dr. Streeter mentioned one of them. One, we can give people more chance to move to areas of opportunity. And the types of moves that typically lead people to opportunity are long-range moves. Moves that bring people into new parts of the country that offer greater opportunities. Okay, those types of moves have become less common over time. So that's one strategy, and there are a whole bunch of approaches, housing mobility approaches, but also just funding a mobility bank that lets people take risky moves, bringing them to different parts of the country. So that has to be one part of a strategy. And then the second part is making sure that in areas that have struggled, in areas where economic opportunities have become more sparse, that we have investments in the core institutions, public schools, libraries, community organizations that prop up a neighborhood, that make sure that if economic conditions go downhill, that the community doesn't fall apart, that kids have a place to go, that the public schools don't deteriorate, that churches don't dry out and people stop coming, okay? These types of investments, which are taken for granted in most communities across the country, have been absent, particularly in low-income communities of color. So we need to make sure that every community across the country has these basic investments that provide the foundation for community life.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Sharkey, I want to pick up on some of those comments, because the issue that I think is incredibly important for our country is to make sure, as you've all addressed, is economic opportunity is everywhere in the country. We're not seeing that now. In fact, the numbers are pretty dramatic. I think Dr. Sharkey mentioned in your testimony as well, is that if you look at just a few geographic areas, most all of the economic growth, I think a 2016 study from the Economic Innovation Group showed that New York City, Miami, Los Angeles, Houston, and Dallas have as large an increase of business as the rest of the nation combined, just those few urban areas. are growing, whereas the rest is being left behind, and we're finding in rural areas in particular as people leave. You mentioned in terms of mobility, one of it is to allow long-range moves, which is true, and I think it's hard for folks who are seeing very difficult to move to those areas that are very expensive. There isn't the social safety net for them, so they stay home. But if we are encouraging people to move, they'll move to these areas, and those areas continue to grow. And you have folks who have the ability to move leaving other areas, you're actually accelerating this situation. And I get your point about investing in these other areas, but it seems as if we actually accelerate it. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, so you have to balance, again, thank you for the question. You have to balance these two goals. One is making sure that every American has access to areas of high growth, and so that partly involves encouraging moves and even risky moves. It also involves transportation policy that brings people nearby those centers of growth that allows them to commute in quickly on high-speed rail and still live in affordable housing nearby. Okay?
That only makes those few areas just bigger.
Well, that's the second part of it, and this is the challenge that we haven't grappled with as a nation right now, is that there are large sections of the country that are left behind, okay? And so the policies that have to be oriented to those sections of the country left behind are very different. This is not about purely focusing on economic growth. It is about making sure that those sections of the country left behind, those towns and cities, have functioning institutions, that as job opportunities become less common, people have access to retraining, people have access to education, people have access to childcare, people have access to financial institutions, okay? Kids have access to community centers, after-school programs. These are the types of investments that can get people back on their feet and that can make a community start to thrive again. But those investments have been absent. And I'll just, there's several programs that it would be good to talk about because they're proofs of concept. One that was carried out in Milwaukee in the mid-1990s was the New Hope program. What was unique about this program is that it was targeted toward people in low-income communities, and it guaranteed community service jobs for anyone who was willing to work 30-plus hours per week. It guaranteed them a job. It was available to people without families. It was available to single men, okay, unlike many of similar programs. It did not just reduce poverty among people who took part, and it was randomly, there was a randomized control trial to evaluate. It did not just reduce poverty and increase work hours, it also affected the children, okay? So it also improved academic performance of people who took part. It reduced behavioral problems of people who took part. So this is a proof of concept that if we provide these kinds of investments, A, it gets people back into the workforce, but B, it also supports families. It brings people back into the community.
A minute left. Anybody else want to take a stab at regional inequality? What do we need to do?
So I'd be happy to add one piece of data to that discussion, and I think we often talk about promoting jobs, and I don't want to downplay that by any stretch. But if you look across the United States at places that have the highest rates of upward mobility, they're not necessarily the places that have had the highest job growth over the last 30 years. A couple of notable examples are places like Atlanta and Charlotte, two localities that have had some of the highest job growth, the highest income growth of any metropolitan area in the United States, but they have some of the lowest rates of upward mobility. And intuitively, what's going on there is that the economy today that is there is, in a sense, importing the talent from other areas of the country. And I think this sort of highlights a distinction when we talk about the role of educational investment, social capital investment. We're talking about the production of that human capital for the next generation that will be in the labor market in whatever city they choose to live as an adult.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, it is now nearly 11:30. We've just completed our first round. We're going to go ahead and start a second round of questioning. We have the room until noon. That's when we get kicked out. We will go as far into the second round as we can before we're evicted. Dr. Hendren, you've previously co-authored a paper in which you discuss racial inequalities in intergenerational mobility. And in that, you cast some doubt on the viability of policies such as temporary cash transfers or minimum wage hikes, at least as far as providing a viable, sustainable solution. Instead, as I understand it, you and your co-authors suggest that intra-neighborhood solutions such as mentorship for African-American boys or efforts to facilitate interaction across racial groups could provide for more effective solutions in the long run. How should we as policymakers, as federal lawmakers specifically, be thinking about increasing access to social capital, not just for this generation, but for future generations as well, looking at it from a sustainability standpoint?
That's a great question. So thanks for the opportunity to talk about that. So you're absolutely right. What we found is that in every neighborhood in the United States, upward mobility for low-income black children is lower than the upward mobility for low-income white children. And so that suggests that in order to address the race gap in economic outcomes that we see in adulthood, you actually have to go within the neighborhood. It's not just about across neighborhoods directly. And so I think what to do on that front. We have some speculative solutions that you discussed, things like mentorship and things like promoting greater integration within neighborhoods and within schools. I think it comes back to some of the earlier discussion about zoning and to what extent people that might live fairly close together are actually growing up in the same community. I think thinking about this as a kind of a national issue, even though the decisions are being made locally, I think that's what's crucial here, is that all of the local decisions that are going on in the local zoning board have national implications. And I think that makes obviously policymaking quite difficult, but I think it's the reality.
Thank you. Dr. Streeter, you cite the enduring connection between civic engagement in America and religion in America. In the past, we've seen some attempts by the federal government to try to incorporate faith organizations into the provision of various services. For example, when George W. Bush was president, he had an Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. How else might public policy protect and perhaps even empower or further the efforts of faith-based organizations and communities in their charity and their civic engagement work?
Great question, and I think the first answer to that is to invite them in, and then to ensure that the barriers to entry are as low as possible while protecting these important distinctions that we have in the First Amendment. I think the regulatory reform work that was done in the Bush administration through that office was actually a good step in the right direction, kind of leveling the playing field without requiring religious quotas or anything like that, but making it easier for organizations that are very missional, whether they're rooted in religion or not, to actually be involved as part of the solution. I think that and this just dovetails off of some comments I made earlier in my prepared remarks. I think that sort of one practical thing we can do as policymakers is look at the way in which our devolutionary policy making gives incentives to municipal leaders and others to invest in institutions very broadly, those that are best equipped to solve problems that they're invited into the solution equation, whether they're religious groups or not. I think that was one of the effects, whether it was superintended or not. I think it's partially intended by welfare reform. I think some of the community partnerships that we've seen in community policing, where neighborhoods really have ownership over the safety of their parks and their streets. A lot of times when you get on the ground and you go to the communities where this is effective, you actually have houses of worship that are involved in those partnerships. And so I think creating incentives without requirements is the best thing to do. And fortunately, we have some things in our own policy-making history that serve as a guide.
Are there things in our own policy making history that also serve as a guide of what not to do? Are there anything in particular maybe harmful?
Yes, I think, well, certainly erecting barriers that go beyond the case law with respect to religious organizations was a problem. This kind of crowding out effect that government programs had on religious organizations. I think a lot of that was corrected during those reforms in the early 2000s that you cited. But I think providing an environment that is overly hostile to houses of worship, it disadvantages communities that need that help the most, where those institutions are super strong. We just have to acknowledge that. And when you look at the civic backbone of this country, you really can't disentangle it from the religiosity of people that are involved. I mean, a lot of our civic activity in this country is fueled and driven by people that are motivated through their faith and through organizations that are faith-based. And so we certainly don't want to crowd out their good efforts.
Thank you. Representative Heck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Hendren, let's talk housing. Did
Sounds
you
good.
study the relationship at all between long-term home ownership and either upward mobility or the factors supporting a strong social capital?
So homeownership in particular is not something that has popped out at us as one of the strongest correlates of upward mobility. We have done a lot of work looking at the role of housing policy, though, in shaping upward mobility for low-income kids, most notably the impact of the Moving to Opportunity experiment relating to some of the discussions we were having earlier about the impact and negative impact of large-scale public housing and investments that were disinvested in over the course of the years.
But that's not a home ownership program.
No, it is not a home
So you did
ownership
not
program.
study home ownership.
So we looked at the, if I recall correctly, and I could get this statistic for you exactly, we looked at the relationship between upward mobility and the fraction of people who own a home, and my recollection is that that was not as strong of a correlate as some of the other things we found, but I could provide that for you afterwards.
I would appreciate it very much, and let me lay out the facts, ask you to accept them as a given for
Sure.
at least now. The fact is that demand far exceeds supply right now, and objective analysis suggests we're about 5 million homes short in this country. It's not uniformly concentrated. It's here and it is there. We're not building enough homes. Construction is not keeping up with demand, and wages are not keeping up with prices. And if you actually follow that through, here's what happens. Because we are especially not building new starter homes now. The profit margins in starter homes is just not there as it once was in this country. So people stay renting. People stay renting, occupancies go up. If occupancies go up, rents go up. This is all verifiable. If rents go up, more people become rent burdened. If more people become rent burdened, more people become subject to the need of publicly subsidized housing. Indeed, more people become homeless. The fact is, notwithstanding popular discussion, the single largest increase in household budgets in the last 15 years is not the cost of a college education and not the cost of health care. It's the cost of shelter. Those of us who have been fortunate to be in our own home for longer than that don't have eyes on that, don't experience that, except insofar as, I'll just use a random example, our 27-year-old son still living upstairs. Not quite sure who that would relate to. Oh yes, it would relate to my household. So this is all despite the fact that home ownership, which is now being deferred and which is now still commonly aspired to by the average American, we have a situation, we are nonetheless at one of the lower percentages of home ownership in modern history. And we also know, these are all facts, that home ownership is the largest net worth building tool of the average American. So I cannot square that it is not a significant factor in upward mobility with that set of facts, that it is the largest increase in household budgets in the last 15 years, that home ownership is being deferred, and that it is the largest net worth building tool of the average American. Can you square your conclusion with that set of facts?
Yes. So what I would say is that when you look across the United States, what you are referring to is more of a what I would argue is a factor that is affecting almost every family, and I think that's largely true. Now, I don't want to say for one second that the role of home ownership has no place in thinking about upward mobility. But what we can say is that when you look across the metropolitan areas of the United States, that is not one of the strongest factors that pulled out to us in the data. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not playing a factor. This comes back to a lot of the discussion we were having at the beginning of the hearing about, do we know exactly what the right policies are for promoting upward mobility? The answer is no, and it very well could be home ownership, and I don't think any of us want to say that that's something that is or is not.
Well, thank you for that. And to say nothing of the fact that if you happen to be a person of color, the long-term pattern is you've been systematically shut out of buying in certain areas, and the manner in which credit is extended to low-income people of color is disproportionate and discriminatory over a long period of time.
I agree with it.
Factor in upward mobility, Dr. Hendren.
And today, in places that were historically redlined, you see lower rates of upward mobility.
Thank you, sir. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Herrera Buehler Butler.
It's a mouthful. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, it's interesting. I think it might have been Representative Schweikert's questions, but I kept hearing a theme about the next generation and children. And if you want to change the trends, yes, we want to improve things for folks today, right now, but if we really want to change I think you were saying velocity. I heard a little bit of Whitney Houston, which I loved. But it is true, if we want to change it, we have to look at where they're at, pick the formative years. You know, I'm thinking about girls in STEM, and, you know, by third grade, if you're not encouraged in math and science, you're going to opt out. And, you know, we've identified some of these more sensitive times. With that in mind, I think this is probably to Dr. Hendren. If better schools and neighborhoods, and similar to what the conversation I think you just had, improve upward mobility for children, it seems important that families have more choices about where they live and where to educate themselves. Families in the study that you've referenced use the federal housing voucher program to make this move, but there are a lot of families who don't fit into that mold, can't access it for many reasons. So they're outside the federal housing program and would like to duplicate this and move to different neighborhoods with greater opportunity or greater flexibility to educate the kids how they want to. What are some ways that we can affect policy to benefit that and loosen those reins a bit, or nudge locals, you know, local municipalities and so on? You know, we can't tell them what to do, but we certainly, I'm thinking about CDBG funds, I'm thinking about housing funds, low-income housing tax credit. There's a lot of things that we do have some rein on.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's exactly right to think about. I think, you know, outside of the voucher program, thinking about the LIHTC program, where are those investments being made, and are they being made from the perspective of trying to improve upward mobility for children? I don't think that's the common lens that's used for guiding those investments today. And so how do we shape at a national level the incentives for those local decisions? And within the voucher program, I do think there's an additional discussion about the ability to make opportunity moves to better neighborhoods for your children using a voucher. There's a lot of discrimination that is faced by voucher holders, by people of color, by people of different backgrounds. And I think policies at a national level that can help break down some of those barriers for families is important.
Good. All right. I yield back. Thank you.
Representative Byer.
Senator, thank you very much. My friend Congressman Heck left, but I wanted to pile on the housing issue, because I noticed one of the recommendations, I think maybe it was Dr. Sharkey's, about ending the mortgage interest deduction and reinvesting all that. Obviously, our realtor friends won't be very happy with that. But the whole notion, I think, of having the mortgage interest deduction in the first place was that the American dream, that every American wants to own their own home, that this will stimulate home ownership. And I had the advantage of living in Switzerland for 4 years, where home ownership was 30% only, relatively low, where 80% of the people lived in apartments. And it was with the increased urbanization of America, what we're seeing in so many places is increased urbanization, people moving to apartments, condos, things like that. By the way, the net worth of the average family in Switzerland is much higher than it is here, as is the lifespan and the happiness. Can you any of you dive a little deeper into whether, yes, right now home ownership is an essential part of our net worth. Does it need to be? And is this now the time in an urbanized America to rethink home ownership and the stimulus that we put to it?
Well, let me start. Thank you for the question, Representative. So I think the broader question that I think about is, how do we invest in housing? And that's where my critique of the mortgage interest deduction comes in. This is a regressive policy. This is a policy that overwhelmingly benefits the highest income Americans and encourages people to buy the most expensive home they can, okay? So when we think about how we want to invest our federal resources in housing, I would prefer a policy that does not encourage people to buy the most expensive home in the most exclusive neighborhood they can, and then to do whatever possible to make sure that property values are stable or that they increase by keeping other people out, by building fewer homes around them. And so that's the pattern of development that we've seen, that there are strong incentives for people to invest heavily so that their home is their main source of assets, and then they have very strong incentives to reduce development around them, to make sure that affordable housing is not built because people are concerned about property values. So my broader approach is, if we are going to invest in housing, I think we should invest in affordable housing. I think we should try to give the opportunity for home ownership or for affordable rental housing to a larger segment of the population.
Very cool. Mr. Quinonez, you talked about how the Mission Asset Fund. How participatory have the community banks, the credit unions, and the big banks been with you in terms of providing the capital necessary to grow that?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a lot of backing from financial institutions to do our work, frankly. Chase, Citi, Bank of America, all those institutions have supported our work because ultimately they're the ones that are actually benefiting from this work, which is, we're expanding the pool of eligible borrowers so that they can go into those institutions and get those loans to buy those homes or get loans to buy cars or start, or invest in their businesses. And so I make sure to remind them of that, that they're there and it's a good thing because we actually want our clients to engage with those mainstream financial institutions, but we also, want them to support the actual work, that goes behind it. But to your prior question about home ownership, I also would love to sort of, for us to sort of think about renters, to sort of say, how can we elevate, again, renters in how they manage their work? Because right now there's a lot of benefit that we accrue to homeowners by way of the homeowners, the interest deductions and so forth, but renters themselves have very little benefit, and so even making rent payments don't get recognized. So I mentioned the idea of including rental payments in credit reports. Could be one of those other ways of incentivizing or supporting that as a housing strategy.
You had a number of bullet points at the back. Congress should clarify that U.S. citizenship is not a prerequisite for a bank account. Do banks think it is a prerequisite now?
So right now, we have heard from some of our clients and even some of our colleague organizations where some banks are actually asking for proof of their legal status, either their proof that they're U.S. citizens or proof that they're legal permanent residents, so that they can even just to maintain their checking account. There's a lot of other financial products that require a Social Security number. And then because of that requirement, that actually leaves out a lot of legal permanent residents. Others that may not have that, they may have an ITIN number, they have other things. But the idea there is that to create a financial product with a requirement of Social Security number actually does leave out a lot of millions of people in America from accessing those services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do this quick, Ms. Quiñonez. There are actually data analytics out there that actually do create sort of an A/B alternative credit score. A lot of alternative lenders already use that.
Yes.
Where some of the barriers, actually those of us, can Fannie, Freddie, others also look at a A/B type credit score system. So the person that's not been traditionally bankable, but has always been really good on their cell phone payment and this and that. And those actually have existed for years now.
That's right.
We took a run at that a few years ago in the Financial Services Committee, but we're not able to get it through. there seems to be, and I know that it's a snapshot, so it's not,
Yeah.
it's hard for you all to do your analytics. In the last particularly 12, 18 months, you know, being someone who, you know, and the staffer right behind me, she's incredibly smart. We've been trying to do digging into the U6 data, some of the other things that come on. We see in employment data and the populations that all of a sudden are gaining work and some of the change in wages. Are you actually seeing that right now this economic growth cycle, this employment cycle, is starting to create some real opportunities or some movement within populations that, as economists or demographers, if it were just a couple years ago, we were saying this population is probably part of our permanent underclass. You know, I obviously have an intense interest in economic mobility. Dr. Hendren, are we starting to see anything, at least as a snapshot, in this current cycle?
So I think the improvement in median wages recently suggests that there are more children, you know, in these current years that are earning more than their parents than there were several years ago. I think that's likely true. And so I think that is obviously a good thing. As we think about coming back to the homeownership question, the role of these financial products, I think the idea of creating pathways for people to grow up, climb up the formal credit system is one way to continue to make that broad-based.
Well, and I know I'm jumping on my own question, but the homeownership housing policy is something I've always been very interested in. It's more complicated. If it's 2009, 10, all of a sudden the fact we bought a house, it becomes a crushing to mobility because you can't sell it, or you're upside down in the mortgage. So we have to sort of understand a vibrant housing market does also create the ability to, I can sell and move, I can chase a job and those things. So it turns out it's more complicated than just the fact it's a forced bank account. Anyone else see actually some interesting things in the data runs of the last 12 months?
I'll share just one quick bit. What we've seen with our clients is that there has been some improvements on their incomes. But what was most interesting is how they managed to couple their wages with government programs or even gifts, or how they manage the money within their family to make ends meet. And so the idea that, you know, that the more choice, or the people that have more strategies for managing income, those are the ones that are better off rather than people that have just very limited or one strategy.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, he may have said the magic word, creating options and choice instead of a sort of bureaucratic command control may be the solution for that optionality that everyone should have. With that, yield back. Thank you all.
Thank you, Congressman Schweikert. I want to thank each of our witnesses. You've been terrific. The testimony you've prepared, both in writing, your prepared statements today, and your answers to our questions have been enormously helpful. And I thank you for coming. This hearing stands adjourned.